Neighbors bring food with death, flowers with sickness, and little things in between. Harper Lee. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I want to thank everyone who's been diligently listening the last couple of weeks, and for any newcomers, welcome. I hope you enjoy the show, and if you would like, we have plenty of a backlog of episodes you can listen to while we wait for the next one. But enough of the standard meet and greet. This week we're going to be finishing up talking about Gobekli Tepe and then comparing it to some of the nearby sites that are part of kind of this same culture or regional group. Which is referred to by some as the Tepeler or Stone Hills or Tepeler culture, what have you. First, though, I did need to talk about one thing that was something I had meant to mention in last week's episode. And I did talk about it last week, but it was in the special episode I mentioned and recorded before the main episode. I didn't go into as much detail as I'm going to, but it kind of threw me off. I crossed off some note stuff, and that kind of carried over to the main episode. And speaking of that episode, possibly 2 weeks from now, maybe a little bit more. We'll see. I'm still kind of trying to map out some stuff, and I may have a delay on the episode 2 weeks from now. I'm still trying to figure things out. But regardless, we'll continue. Just wanted to give everyone a little bit of forewarning. So there were a large number of stone bowls and vats and other kinds of containers that you could think of discovered at Gobekli Tepe. And interesting enough, they were found while they were putting up tenting to kind of guard the site from wind and rain, as well as provide cover from the sun for people visiting the site. Because they were kind of trying to make it a little bit more tourist friendly to try to draw interest and funding. Initially, they thought that this might have been like a trash bin or a midden. After a closer look at the artifacts and analysis of the location and items found in the area, they discovered that the dumping ground theory was probably not correct. In fact, it was rather quickly thrown out. It was a concentration of intact stone vessels and limestone troughs kind of made into the ground almost. The number of which is quite a bit more than you would find at other sites occupied at a similar time frame. And they examined the residues found on the containers and found traces of a few likely substances. This included a kind of what was probably similar to porridge or maybe grits if you're in the southeast. And there was also evidence of fermentation of what was probably barley or emmer, meaning, a type of beer or proto or pseudo beer, some type of fermented beverage, or possibly mixed in with some fruits to help kind of add some sugar to the mix, because I do think they found like what could have been wild grapes or berry like stems that may have been in that as well. Now, humans have probably been experimenting with fermented beverages since the beginning, probably well before we were even Homo sapiens. Waiting for fruits to get overripened and all that kind of stuff. Wild fermented fruits and things like that attract all types of wild animals, and even I'm sure other Homo species took part, Erectus or Gaster, Neanderthals, what have you. But this is the first site where I'm aware of evidence of deliberate production has been found. And it appears from the few plant remains found that the concoctions were, again, made from wild sources or very early strains of domesticated crops, or a mix between the two, with a few wild fruits thrown in. So this does give credence to some part of Klaus Schmitz's theory of Gobekli Tepe's importance. There does appear to have been kind of a communal sourcing of food for more than just a standard day-to-day meal. Though again, this is evidence of more than just groups of hunter-gatherers meeting up seasonally at a hunting ground. It takes planning, knowledge of essentially basic chemistry, though they wouldn't have recognized it as that, and time to prepare and ferment your beer. This is the kind of setup you would make if you're living at a place for longer stretches of time, if not permanently. So again, we see more problems emerge with the initial interpretation of the site, despite that there may be parts of it that were true, such as it maybe being a communal celebration location. But now, though, I want to get into the sister sites of Gobekli Tepe. Again, sometimes referred to as the Tepeler culture, which culture may not be the best or most appropriate term, but I don't think there's any doubt that there is a level of communication and connection that goes far beyond simple proximity and basic trade. We can debate what a culture actually is, and in fact we will do that when I move to some of the episodes about how cities develop. But for now, though, I just want to talk about kind of some of the sites, how they're similar to Gobekli Tepe, and how they're each kind of different. And this is a total of, I think right now, there are 12 to 13 main sites, and possibly some that are kind of maybe proto-sites or offshoots that happen at the end of the Tepeler culture as these larger, more established settlements kind of break apart and disappear from the archaeological record. The sites we're going to focus on, or at least I'm going to talk about more in depth in this episode, and again, that's not all of them, but we have Gucru Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Karahan Tepe, and Nevali Cori as well. And there are a few others that may be Tepeler sites that maybe not necessarily counted 100%, but definitely have some influences. And one of those is Kayono Tepeshi. I may get into that, may not. We'll see how much time we have. But there are other sites that are in this group. Hamzan Tepe, Tasli Tepe, Inali Tepe, Basaran Hoyuk, and a few others. But again, Tepe means hill, so most of these are named kind of based on some type of description of the hill that they are buried under. And I think, I'm trying to think which the best one to start with is. I think we will start with Çakmak Tepe, which means lighter hill. And this is a fairly new site. And when I say new, I mean in terms of excavated. I don't think they started excavating this until, I would say it was 2020, 2021, somewhere in that time frame. And this site is not large. It's only, I think, about 150 meters, like in terms of area that it kind of covers. And it is to the southwest of Sanla Urfa. So Sanla Urfa, or Edessa, or whatever you refer to it as, is kind of in between Chakmak Tepe and Gobekli Tepe. And Chakmak means, from my understanding of, and believe me, my Turkish is not strong at all, but from what I got from translating, it means lighter. I don't know if that means that, if that's a reference to color, or if it is an actual reference to an actual lighter. Maybe the hill looked like the tip of like a little butane lighter or something along those lines. I don't know. But what you find at Chakmak Tepe that is similar to Gobekli Tepe is that there is evidence of progression of kind of how houses evolved. You start with just wooden posts kind of in a circular tent design covered by animal hide. Then you get wood supports for circular stone dwellings, and then there's a slow progression to square or rectangular designs. But again, this is not a huge location, and I'm not sure the exact dates. They are still kind of studying and timing them, but this is before our timeline of 8,000 to 6,000. But I figured I'd bring it up because this is evidence that that Gobekli Tepe did not just come from nowhere. This is a precursor site. Some have, I think, have referred to it as the missing link. Kind of like just show the progression, and it is a little bit further than away from some of the other Tepeler sites. It's not within the stone hills proper. I guess it's on its outskirts. But they do have similarities as well. The art, in terms of the animal design, is very similar. Although there's nowhere near the size. The pillars are not there. There are more like, I guess you might consider it handheld art. But they do repeats a lot of the same animals. Foxes are one of the big ones. And you can see they're like kind of carved in threes, and they're very similar poses to some of what you see on the Gobekli Tepe pillars. They're also able to link this site with another, I guess, a precursor. A lot of the tools are in a similar design to the Kimian culture. So it's very likely that the Kimian culture had a very large influence on the Stone Hills culture. So just keep that in mind. Now, what was the entirety of the Stone Hills culture made up of descendants from the Kimian? Obviously, we can't say that. I do believe they have recovered some human remains, and they are going to be doing DNA testing on them. So that's very exciting if they can actually get usable DNA to kind of examine and see what we can learn from there. They found a number of animal bones, of course. They're all wild cattle, wild sheep, deer, antelope, hedgehogs, interestingly enough, wild horses or equids, possibly onagers, maybe something like that. And of course, rabbits as well are another big thing that they found at that site. So yeah, Chakmak Tepe is, right now, it's the earliest example of this culture, and it's a very basic but very distinctive site. So you can definitely see the similarities to a lot of the drawings, or the carvings, I should say. And that might be part of the reason they moved. They had dug in very basic cisterns as well, similar to what you'll see at Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. But it does look like the area maybe got drier a little bit earlier than the places they moved. But it's also possible that they moved into the hills so they could get access to limestone, just have it close at hand. Because I imagine carrying large quantities from the stone hills through kind of the plain of San La Urfa and then into the hills around Gucru Tepe probably was not very fun. But say we'll that's all just speculation at this point. Now let's move on to Nevali Cori. Now this is a site that comes up right around 8400 BCE, and it lasts till right around a little bit after 8000 from what I've read. So this is kind of a very early breakaway point from Gobekli Tepe. And it's also kind of on its own. It's to the northwest of where Gobekli Tepe is. It's the most northern and I think the most western Tepeler site that was founded after, after the Gucru Tepe kind of moved into the area. And unfortunately, this site has been lost. It is now underneath the lake that has formed around the Ataturk Dam, which was constructed in the 80s. And I think the excavation of this site, they did like an emergency excavation similar to that location we talked about in Syria. They excavated for about, I think it was just under 10 years. I think it's from like 82 to 92 or 91, something like that. And it wasn't a huge site, but they did find a lot of evidence of what has, what may have been the very oldest domesticated strain of wheat. So it's possible that this was kind of like an early, maybe a colony or an early group trying to establish another settlement, kind of in a similar vein to the other stone pillar or stone hill sites. And they have those same monolithic pillars there. Except theirs were built into the stone walls. They would put the stones around, or the walls around the stones. They would kind of put them in them. They also had the terrazzo style cement lime floor. But the site doesn't last very long. It's only there again for a few hundred years, and then it is abandoned. Now, that may not have been the case. That may have just been what they could excavate in time. And it's something that could have maybe been misdated. We don't know. But you do see a difference of, or some developments that are a little bit unique to them that is not necessarily something you see at Gobekli Tepe. They have more human figures kind of designed in bowls and things like that. Which again, Gobekli Tepe has some human figures, but they're not very detailed. They also had what was probably similar to that skull cult or potential skull cult. They found a lot of human skulls and some bodies that were not 100% completed, but I think they found most of the human remains they found there were skulls. And they also had a lot of jewelry designed like a snake, which is something you'll see at a few other of these stone hills sites. Now, we think we know where people went after they left Nevali Cori, or at least some of the people went. I'm sure some returned to the remaining stone pillar locations, if not Gobekli Tepe itself, because Gobekli Tepe is, they think, the closest of the locations. Even though Nevali is kind of out on its own, it is still fairly close to Gobekli Tepe, at least compared to the other sites. So this may have been a, just something that they tried. It didn't work out, and they returned. But there is another site a little bit further to the east, kind of where the Tigris and the Euphrates meet in the north of Iraq, or kind of between them there, and that's called Kayano Tepeshi, and that is from about 8,600 to about 6,800, and they also have very early strains of emmer and einkorn, very similar to what they found at Nevali Cori. So perhaps that they were a breakaway group from either another stone pillar culture, or maybe the Nevali Cori people, after maybe they were too close to the people in the stone hills, and there was a disagreement, and they had to move a little bit further away. All options I've read, all possible. But Kayono does not have, as far as I'm aware, there hasn't been any kind of stone pillars or the same kind of religious or spiritual iconography that you see at some of the other stone hills sites. So who knows? That's just a fancy way of saying we're not quite sure. But yeah, so let us move on to Sefer Tepe. That is, I think, a very interesting location. Now, Sefer Tepe is also on the newer side of these sites that has been studied, not as recent as Chakmak Tepe, but I think in the 2000s it was discovered, and it's been excavated steadily every season, like most of these sites are. There are a number of teams that kind of operate in the same area every year, and they investigate kind of their own sites, and they invite international people in, and they all kind of collaborate and talk about what they've discovered. And then there are people that are always at the same site every year, but it's all kind of under the umbrella of the Istanbul University and the Stanley Urfa Archaeological Museum. They all kind of pull resources and all that kind of stuff. And the site I mentioned last week, they do updates on these other sites as well, which is where we're getting some information in this episode. Now, Sefer Tepe is kind of contemporaneous with some of the later Gobekli Tepe sources, and this site is far to the west. Far to the east. Is the easternmost of the stone pillar culture, or stone hills culture, and it has some similarities to Gobekli Tepe. They have T-shaped pillars. They have, again, some of the same kind of animal motifs, but they do have some of their own uniqueness as well. All of the housing, as far as I'm aware, dates towards the late pre-pottery Neolithic period, so it's almost all square. They also, in their walls, have a type of mortar, which is not something that you see at some of these other sites where they're kind of all stuck together and held in place just by weight. They have taken samples of this mortar to kind of try to break it down chemically to see what it's made out of. So, we'll see what the results for that are. And that is from that's from the end of last year. So this is new information. We will see what happens, probably within the next year or so. Now, another new kind of discovery at Sefer Tepe, and it's a very interesting one, is that you have 6 pillars kind of parallel to each other in kind of almost a square or a shorter rectangle, and they were used to hold up some type of platform, probably made of wood. Now, you don't see this in any other Tash Tepeler sites, at least as far as I'm aware. It's not been mentioned, but this same kind of structure or platform has been found in a couple of sites further to the east. Now, this is interesting because these are kind of in the basin of the Tigris River, whereas all the Tash Tepeler sites are in the Euphrates River, at least the headwaters. So Sefer Tepe may have had links to sites further to the east, or it may have been a progenitor site to some of those other ones. We will probably learn more as time goes on, because again, all of this is still in the early phases. Every year, more and more is discovered. Apologies for that notification. Also, at this site, a large amount of jewelry has been found, which it's been found at the other sites, but I was able to actually see pictures of these. They have some very interesting green stones. I'm not sure. I don't think it's jade. I didn't see exactly what they're made of, but they come in all shapes and sizes. There are some larger ones. There are some very small beads that were, of course, probably strung together. So that's another level of continuity or similarity. I also believe they found some snake-like designs on some of those jewels. So there is some type of snake motif going on for a number of these Tash Tepeler sites. So that's some more similarities. Now let's switch over to Karahan Tepe. Now, Karahan Tepe is actually believed to be slightly older than Gobekli Tepe. I think right now, the most recent dating I've seen puts it to around, 9,400, give or take, as when it first was occupied. And it has some similarities, again, to Gobekli Tepe. It has the same kind of stone pillars with some of that deep bas relief. But this site is much more, or it has a much better, record or, evidence of people living there year-round. Now, this site is a little bit further to the south east of Gobekli Tepe, and it is actually close to a couple of smaller rivers that are near, the headwaters of the Euphrates. So a little bit better water source. So it probably had a slightly larger population, or at least had a better time supporting its population than Gobekli Tepe did. But they have some interesting things that do not show up at Gobekli Tepe. At least nothing similar I've seen. They do have more human-esque figures kind of carved into the stone. Things like I saw one and read about it, and it's basically a human that appears to be carrying like a leopard on his back. There is a statue that has kind of like a singular body and then two different heads, human heads, obviously, and then they have realistic features, though they're both different. So there are those that think this might be like a display of duality, maybe between young and old, man and woman, what have you. There are also a number of what appear to be possibly masked humans. So they're human heads and shapes, but they're kind of got something over them. So it could be like a depiction of some type of shaman or what have you. And then, of course, you have your standard animal carvings, foxes, spiders, some spiders on humans, oddly enough, like on their chests. So, yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff here at Karahan Tepe. And again, it shows up earlier in the archaeological record. It has more evidence of long-term settlement. It is better suited to settlement. The question is, why did it kind of break down? As far as I know, it ends slightly before Gobekli Tepe, at least from what we can tell. And I'm not 100% on that, so take that with a little bit grain of salt. It's hard to get an idea of when these sites are truly, fully abandoned. Obviously, the less activity in a location for a given period of time, the less trace is left, but that doesn't mean that there's no one there. Also, this site is a very good example of backfilling, of locations being buried by people while new buildings are expanded on or kind of built from the ground up. And I had someone ask, how do we know that it was backfilled and it wasn't something like an earthquake or a landslide? Typically, landslides, at least this is my understanding from reading the science. So, and again, I'm not an archaeologist. I'm not a geologist. That's not my background. But I will take them, at their expertise and at their word. Typically, for landslides or things of that nature, you see all the earth moving in one direction. Whereas the layers here, you have it all kind of coming from multiple ways. So it looks like these people are pushing in dirt over the top of these places and then like patting it in from multiple angles. Because these circular sites, or these kind of more temple or ritualistic locations in both Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, are actually almost, they're not subterranean, but they are kind of have like a little, almost a walkway dug into the earth around them, and then you'd have to kind of crawl up almost and crawl down to get into them. So they're almost subterranean, almost. Like you can see the roofs of them from, where you'd be walking or living or working in the area, and you'd have to kind of walk down almost like you're going into a cave or into the underworld, what have you, depending on how far along they are in, I guess what you might consider a cultural or spiritual development, or what their ideas were. Not necessarily that it's, more developed to think of the underworld as a cave or a separate place or what have you. But yeah, so that's kind of the highlights of Karahan Tepe, and I'm kind of shortchanging it here. There's a lot more to go into, but honestly, you could go in to a lot of these places and they have their own episode. I'm just trying to kind of highlight what makes them unique and how they're similar to kind of show that there is maybe some type of continuity and connection in these places. But all of these sites, as well as Gobekli Tepe, are mostly abandoned by the end of our time frame. However, there is another location that is kind of at the end of this culture, or it might be the last bastion of this culture, and it lasts, I think, right up to the end of our timeline, and that is Gucru Tepe, or possibly Gucru, depending on how the Turks would pronounce that. Again, I'm not 100% on my Turkish, so I do apologize. But Gucru does mean, from what I can tell, again, rough translation is Georgian, so it's the Georgian hill, which might make sense if you think about it, because Gucru is actually, unlike these other sites that are kind of out in the hills and in the wilderness, Gucru is actually not all that far from Sanla Urfa. In fact, it's on the outskirts. It may even be within like the city limits proper. It's kind of like almost out in the suburbs. So if you think about it, this might have been the perfect place to go once the weather in the Stone Hills got less humid and more dry. You move down from the hills, you kind of get onto a plain near a stream that kind of runs through the area. And again, this is the site of the city of Edessa. It's in a very important part of the region and the history of the region. So this site is a good site for even a modern city, or a more modern city than what you would have at maybe Karahan Tepe or Gobekli Tepe. And why it's called the Georgian Hill, I don't know. This is an assumption, though, and maybe that's a dangerous thing, but Georgians are from the Caucasus, which is not too far from the Anatolian Peninsula. It's very possible that it could have been home to like a Georgian colony, or like a Georgian kind of a merchant association or guild that lived in Edessa and kind of facilitated trade between some Georgian polity and either the Byzantines who held the site or held the site, or possibly the county of Edessa, or some later Islamic polity or state in the area. And this could have just been a location to that Georgians were welcome to live or allowed to live, and they just made their home over the site. That is my guess for how this name came about, and of course I'll try to research that in the future, but that was just me kind of spitballing and theorizing. But why Gucru Tepe is important to our discussion here, and probably the best way to kind of end this episode and series of episodes. So this site is occupied, again, right up until, I think, maybe a couple hundred years before 6000 BC. And you see stone tools very similar to what you would find at the other Tepeler sites. They also have that green stone, which I remembered is called serpentine, and they've even found some axe-like heads that would be made of that. Now, I don't think they think those are necessarily the best things to make axe heads from, but it is possible that there was some kind of ceremonial purpose for those axes. You don't have any of the large stone pillars, but you do kind of see a lot of, again, smaller animal designs, carvings, things like that. And interestingly enough, and probably the most interesting thing that they found in terms of possible religious or spiritual development is that there has been it's a seated figure. It's a human figure. I don't think there's much of a way to tell if it's male or female, and that is up for debate right now. But it's kind of similar to some items that you even see far to the west at Catalhoyuk, where there is what is possibly like a female mother goddess or something along those lines, like this, kind of robust female. And that's not something that we've seen too much of at the Tepeler sites. There is some slight evidence that there may have been something along those lines towards the end of the period, or something developing kind of as agriculture took hold. But that's not really something that you see. That's all speculation, basically, is what I'm saying, at least for the Tepeler sites. The actual potential mother cult or earth goddess or whatever you want to call it is actually further to the west. So it's possible that there is some type of cross-pollination between this last kind of outpost of the Gucru, or the Stone Hills people, and peoples further to the west, whereas maybe at like Sefer Tepe you have more relations to people further to the east. But who can say? But Gucru Tepe is very, very recent excavation. I think the first excavation was actually last year. So they're still kind of digging into this. But this is not a huge site. It's actually, again, it's kind of in the outskirts of Sandler Urfa, which has seen a lot of development in recent years. Partly because, actually, of the dam in that area further north where Nevali Cori is. Because of that, regulating a lot of the water in the area, Sandler Urfa can actually support a lot more agriculture. If you look at maps from the area, like aerial maps, like taken from either airplanes or satellites from like even the like early 90s and now, it is much, much greener in the area. So a lot of stuff at Gucru Tepe has actually been damaged or partly dug up from other development in the region. So we may have lost some artifacts, but again, this wasn't a huge location as far as I can tell. But it would have been within sight of Gobekli Tepe if it was still above ground. You could have seen the location from there. And I believe you could also see Karahan Tepe on a clear day. I could be wrong about that, though. But, yeah, so you kind of see a lot of tools that have been strictly, or not strictly, but a lot of tool continuity that has been carried over. You can see it has like a stage of progression between a lot of these Tepeler sites and the end at Gucru Tepe. But for whatever reason, this is kind of where the culture kind of disappears from the archaeological record. Now, we are still not sure why this happened. It could have been, and I think the most popular theory is because the weather just got too dry. After the end of the Younger Dryas, where it was much wetter and humid, that the area just could not support any type of agriculture, and even wild plants may have been dying off. There just may not have been any wild vegetation, and that probably drove a lot of the wild herds from the area away. So that forced the various people living in the region to move to more, more fertile ground, which I do think is the best kind of solution. There's no evidence that any of these sites were destroyed with fire. It looks like it was deliberate burials, which, we haven't talked about too much, but, if they are deliberately burying these sites, knowing that they're not returning or they're not going to be using anymore, this may be the only instance in history where a culture has chosen to end itself, I guess, for lack of a better term. But again, there's a lot to debate about what is or isn't a culture. We'll get into that again in more detail later. But I think what this sites kind of show us, I started off talking these episodes about Gobekli Tepe because this is kind of the big discovery for this time frame. And it was very important, and it remains important, and it has its own uniqueness even among all these sites. But these other sites also have their own uniqueness. So it's very important that we do not take all of these sites in on an individual basis. When studying this region, and this time frame of this region, it's very important that we compare and contrast the various sites to each other and seeing what's happening at one and maybe not happening at another, because it may not have been as unified as it seems. Again, there might be certain tools that one city developed and another didn't, or that was useful in one place and not another. There are certain artistic styles that seem to be carried over between sites, possibly religious. We have the skull cult, which is not just in this region, but in other places. And there, of course, there's the burying of your ancestors in your homes. That is something that is also kind of shared across the region, not just in the Stone Hills. So there may have been what was the real difference between, say, the sites in the Levant and the Stone Hills? Tools, mainly. The material they're using, yes. What they're using to survive, yes. But it's hard to kind of just look at one site and come up with all the answers, is what I'm saying. It needs to be something that's kind of investigated from a number of angles at other locations. And there's actually, after this part, for this region, there is kind of a break of continuity in the area. We don't really see too much large-scale habitation in this region until, agriculture has spread from the Fertile Crescent. You have these cities further to the south and things like that. And by that point, I think the region probably suffered very heavily when the weather changed. But once, people and animals left it, it kind of got to a balance, more in line with like the type of rainfall and water it was getting. It probably, basically it had time to kind of even out or reach a new base level or kind of a level of homeostasis, I guess. But of course that led people to leave. That probably led to the spread of a number of agricultural and animal innovations or strains of agriculture and animals that cross-pollinated with people maybe in the Levant or further east or further west. Maybe they kind of helped each other develop their own separate semi-domesticated or domesticated strains. No large-scale warfare, at least as far as we can tell, which can be hard to see, especially if it's just like a one-off battle. There's not a whole lot of depictions of violence between humans in the stone artwork, so it may not have been something that particularly stood out to them or that they had any kind of, anything to say about that kind of thing. But again, that's just guesses. We honestly don't know. let's see. Culturally, we've already talked about, maybe shared religious practices. There is, again, that small sign of maybe an Earth Mother cult or a female goddess of some kind developing. The individual carrying the leopard was a fun one for me. I don't know of any, maybe it's just a funny story. A dude saves a leopard. Maybe he tried to, maybe he tried to tame it. It didn't work. Who knows what that could be. I'm not aware of any leopard gods, later in time. I know that there are no anthropomorphic leopard gods or gods associated with control of leopards until much later, actually. I know that there is an Egyptian goddess that was leopard skinned. She was not she didn't have a leopard head, but she had kind of leopard spots. I know there's a god in India that is an actual leopard or a tiger. I think he kind of changes between, what he needs to be for any given situation. But obviously those are not in this region. And again, there are no stories of them carrying a leopard. That is what they share with leopards. Now there is another god, again, that later has been thought to come from Anatolia, or possibly from Anatolia, that's still up for debate, and that is Dionysus. He is kind of sometimes depicted as wearing leopard skins and riding leopards. Now that is the opposite of what is happening in that stone carving. But sometimes stories evolve over time. And it should be noted that Dionysus, I think, is said to have come, at least in some stories, he's said to have come from the east, or in this case, possibly Turkey. Some say it's more along the kind of the Palestinian Syrian coasts, possibly Tyre. It's hard to say, but we'll break down more of that later when we get to later mythology. But I think it's an interesting thing that perhaps some type of leopard god may have been a very, very old story that got carried forward. But yeah, I think that's kind of a good place to stop. Some wild speculation that I haven't seen anywhere else. But yeah, so I hope you've enjoyed kind of these episodes. This is a little bit longer than I was planning on making this one. I got a couple of sidetracked on a couple of things and expanded on some stuff I forgot to cover last week. So I hope you enjoy this one. If you have any feedback or constructive criticism or anything like that, please feel free to email me at waradrevpod@gmail.com, or you can send me a message on Twitter. I'm also on YouTube, where I've been putting up some of our backlog of episodes. I need to do more of that. I'm getting behind again. I'm going to try to put up a few of those this week. I also uploaded a little bit of a playthrough I recorded for another kind of bonus episode that I'm planning on doing for it's a game called Far Cry Primal. Got about an hour and a half of that up on YouTube now. It's uncut. It's me talking, just rambling, similar to this. But it's a video, so it's not just audio. But you can reach me there. If you have a YouTube or use YouTube, please, subscribe there. Kind of get the channel numbers up on YouTube a little. But yeah, I'd like to thank you again for listening, and please feel free to reach out however you can. But I'd like to say thank you and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.